Let me share with you 3 things that you need to know when you're first starting to watercolor. We'll talk about painting wet next to wet. We'll also talk about painting on a wet paper. That is called wet on wet. And we'll talk about painting on a dry paper, which is wet on dry. So the first thing we're going to do to get started is we're going to get our paints wet. So I'm using a spray bottle. I'm just going to get these paints wet, and I kind of like to get them nice and juicy so that they're easier to get some pigment. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to paint just a little bit of color. I'll just grab this blue here, and we're going to paint a little bit of color on our paper. And I want to show you, it's really easy for your colors to bleed into another area that you don't want them to if you're not careful. So let me show you what I mean. So when I'm painting, if I wanted to paint, say, stripes, I would paint every other stripe, and then I would let it dry before I went back and painted that middle stripe. Because what happens is if I wanted to paint right next to it, if it's wet, you can see as I start painting, if I touch it, it bleeds into it. So let me just touch it, and I can show you how that bleeds in. If it's dry, it actually, can you see how it bleeds into it, and you'll get little pockets of color that come up into your paint. And if it's partially dry, then you get kind of a little hard edge, which is called a blossom. So the first thing to do is to remember that whenever you're painting with watercolor, you never paint against something that's partially wet if you don't want it to be bleeding into that at all. So you always selectively choose where you want to paint, and maybe even bounce around a little bit so that you're not painting next to anything that's wet. The second thing is wet on wet. And wet on wet is when your paper is wet. So let me just rinse my brush out, and we're going to just get the paper wet. Okay, so wet on wet, what that does is that gives you a nice soft look. So the reason for wet on wet is to blend colors together, and they'll be nice and soft. Or if you're trying to get a transition of the same color with different values. So if I wanted to paint, let me just use a little bit of this green here. If I wanted to paint a couple different colors, I'm just going to drop some color in here. And then maybe I want a little bit of the gold here. If I'm working wet on wet, what happens is the water does all the work for you. So instead of focusing on trying to blend it in, you can just put it in, and you can let the water kind of do that work for you. So you can see how it gives me a nice soft edge, and I can also tip it so that I am using gravity a little bit. I just dry that little dollop there. If I can tip it, I can actually tip and tap, and I can get a nice blend of colors. So here you're not seeing a hard edge. So a wet on wet, what that does is that gives you a soft edge. So maybe a sky, you're wanting to have a nice soft change of color or value, then you'll get the whole paper wet, and you'll start putting the color in and let those colors blend together, or those values blend together, and it will be nice and soft. A lot different than if you're working wet on dry. So let me show you with a wet on dry. If I'm working wet on dry, I'm usually trying to get a nice crisp edge. So if I'm painting and I want it to be, maybe if it's a landscape, I want it to be in the foreground, I want it to have a crisp edge instead of a soft edge, then I would paint wet on dry. So if I'm painting wet on dry, my paper is completely dry, and I make sure I don't have too much water on my paintbrush, but I can have enough pigment in it, and you can you see how hard of an edge I can get? Even though the value changes, I can get a nice hard edge because my paper is dry. So let's just talk about this. One other way, I just want to show you another way that we can do this, and that this is wet on wet. Let's see, I'm sorry, and this is wet paint right here. Just reviewing what we just did before. And I'm going to put some yellow. I'm going to paint right next to it. Can you see how that just bleeds into that? If you don't want it to bleed, don't paint right next to it. If you want it to blend together, remember you're going to paint wet on wet. So you get your paper wet first, and you put your colors in, and then you let the blending happen just by the water, or you use gravity to help them blend together a little bit. You can get a nice soft edge. And if you want a hard edge, then the very best thing to do is work wet on dry and get a nice crisp edge. So just to go over that real quickly, remember that if you're painting wet on dry, you're going to get a nice crisp edge. And if you're painting wet on wet, you're going to get a soft edge like this. If you're painting next to something that is already wet and you don't want it to bleed into it, then make sure it dries before you paint next to it, or you'll get an effect similar to this. Thanks for joining me today. And as always, please subscribe below. And if you're interested in learning how to watercolor, you can check out our online watercolor courses. We have a variety of different courses available. And one of them is the Watercolor Starter Pack. And in this course, we go over the very basics of watercolor techniques, how to do them, and when you'd use that technique to get a certain effect. So if you're interested in learning how to watercolor, you can check out the watercolor links below. See you next time.